Um, Before I kick it off with Susan, I do just want to give a quick intro to this speaker series for those of you who are new to this, and then we'll jump in to the conversation. But this is a bi-monthly speaker series featuring different leading thinkers, practitioners, and industry experts. It's really a series that is open to all giving circles on the Grapevine platform and beyond. And so we really cover a broad range of topics and locations. And so please do continue to let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. And even if you're part of a giving circle, it's always great to see what giving circles are represented on these calls. Before I jump into the session, what I do also want to share just briefly is a little bit more about Grapevine. I think some people on these calls are newer to Grapevine as an organization as well. And so Grapevine is a platform that powers giving circles. We're really the only platform that is dedicated to this movement, that is providing an online home and a broader community for leaders and members. So we provide the infrastructure, tools, and training and events to support and scale the overall giving circle movement. We're also now helping to start new giving circles in many different places across the country. And so if you're here because you recently learned about one of those giving circles, we'll share some more information in the chat on some other events where you can come and learn more about those groups, ask questions, and see how you might like to get involved. So please make sure to look out for that and join us for one of those sessions as well. Okay, so without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce our guest today, Susan McPHERSON. Susan is a serial connector, angel investor, and corporate responsibility expert. She is the founder and CEO of McPHERSON Strategies, a communications consultancy focused on the intersection of brands and social impact. Susan is a part of this year's 50 over 50 impact list curated by Forbes magazine as well. Congrats, Susan. Susan is regarded as one of the best connected people in the social good world. She has sat on the board of organizations like the UN Refugee Agency and the Lower East Side Girls Club. And her book, The Lost Art of Connecting, which is what we'll be talking more about today, is a practical guide to building genuine connections and reclaiming the power of human contact. So thank you so much, Susan, for being here. What an impressive resume.
Thank you. It's what happens when you get old. You just piling on info and hopefully accolades. Hopefully.
Oh, I think what happens when you have a lot of energy, you know, and passion and commitment to the space.
That's true. But thank you. It's a joy to be here with you and with everybody else. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, so to kick us off, Susan, I just wanted to start by setting a little bit of context today, because I'm not sure how many of us on the call saw this recent report from the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. But in that report, he found that 1 in 2 adult Americans suffer from loneliness and feelings of social isolation. And so some people would say we're actually amidst a loneliness epidemic. And we see this in our work with giving circles as well, because when we are talking to people about joining giving circles, we're often hearing that these people are they're searching for a way to make new connections and build more meaningful relationships with others in their community. It's really a big part of why we see people joining giving circles. They, of course, want to amplify their impact. They want to give back, but it's so exciting, the idea to be able to do that while also building these kinds of connections.
Sure.
So Grapevine, we talk a lot about how giving circles can be a powerful tool, a powerful vehicle through which people can connect with others, and really almost like an antidote to this loneliness epidemic by creating that real opportunity for people to connect and meaningfully engage with each other. And so there are many reasons why we're excited to have you here today, Susan, but one in particular is this practical framework, the Gather, Ask, Do method that you've developed, and how this can give both Giving Circle members and leaders a real clear way to connect with and contribute to and benefit from really their Giving Circle community and experience, which could ultimately help counteract this growing trend of disconnection and isolation that we see. So we'll get into your practical methodology in a moment, but first would love to have you kick us off, Susan, just with your view on when did connection become a lost art? Can you point to a particular moment or
January 2nd, 2019. No,
Do you have the exact time?
Yeah. No. Well, a couple of thoughts. But first of all, in addition to the U.S. Surgeon General, just last week or the week before, the World Health Organization also came out with a proclamation about the health issues caused by loneliness, and not just for the elderly, but we know the elderly inextricably suffer greater when these types of issues arise. But for me, it was very much of a kind of a process. A lot of times when people have seen the title of my book, they assumed it was in reaction to the pandemic, because the pandemic was extremely isolating. But actually, the book proposal was written in 2017. And by the time, for those of you who have ever written a book or attempted to write a book, it's quite a process. So I didn't even start writing it until February of 2020. And of course, we knew what happened in March of 2020. Yeah. So this definitely came long before the pandemic. But it was a couple of things. And let me give you a little bit of background on me. Growing up in the late 60s, early 70s, every morning at the breakfast table, my parents would have the 5 local newspapers, plus yesterday's or the day before's New York Times and Boston Globe, because they would come via the mail. We lived in upstate New York. And the papers would be splayed out, and they would have their scissors and razor blade, clipping and cutting articles. Then they would go to their respective manual typewriters and type short little missives to, in my dad's case, he was a college professor for 40 years. So students, former students, students' mothers, you name it. My mom did public relations for PBS. So she'd be sending articles to journalists and influencers, family, friends, etc. And off into the postal mail, these clips would go. And they did this every day. And I assumed everybody's parents did that. Okay? So in the late 80s, when I was coming into the world professionally, I got my first fax machine. And I could do what they did, but instantaneously. Even though I don't think those faxes ever got to their destinations, because I don't know about you all, but I could never figure out how to use a fax machine. And then 10 years later, the internet happened. And I could put 15 people on an email and tell them about a particular cause and get them excited about a cause. So long before, the internet, or long before giving circles. But by doing that, I was connecting. And then 10 years later, we had the advent of social media. So as each of these kind of, let's just say, decades of new technology, what I started to see was people lost the intentionality. So to me, it's the lost art of being intentional when we connect, because it is so easy to zap off a note without thinking about it, without thinking about what the effects of that DM or that post on Twitter is going to mean to people. And in 2016 or 2017, a friend of mine said to me that when she took her son and daughter to the school bus stop and she hugged them both goodbye, and they got up on the big yellow school bus, as soon as they took their respective seats, their heads went down looking at their handheld device.
Sounds familiar.
But here's the catch. Every other child on the school bus did the same thing. And I thought to myself, well, I don't have absolutely amazing memories of my school bus rides, but I talked to my classmates. So all of this led to what I thought was the lost art. We're more connected than we've ever been in all of like humankind, but that intentionality, that care. And that's where, quite frankly, your organization, people are coming together with real intentionality and real care, right? Because they're thinking about ways they can be bettering. Like there's nothing more intentional than like giving.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't mean, I'm not trying to market your amazing organization, but I think that is what has been lost, and what I, in writing the book, was hoping to help people find.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a great point about giving circles too, which is a model we certainly did not create, right? This has been a whole grassroots movement since the early 80s. We're just trying to bring it online and make it easier for people to participate. But that definitely resonates. And it also reminds me actually of Bowling Alone. Have you read that book about like the evolution of this disconnection that has happened over the last several decades, right? And it's kind of ironic how we're more connected than ever, and yet less connected than ever as a result.
I mean, look, the pandemic didn't do us any favors, but what I have what I've come to realize since then is we don't want to have that isolation, right? I think it opened our eyes to how painful that isolation can be. I mean, I live alone. I don't have parents. I don't have kids, and I don't have a spouse. And the dog that I had during, before the pandemic, leading up to it, unfortunately, she doesn't speak English. So she wasn't much of a conversationalist.
Yeah, that's, dogs, once if they could figure that part out, it's
I know, but
they're
then we
almost
probably wouldn't
perfect.
like them as much.
That's true. Fair. Well, thank you for that, Susan. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about this gather, ask, do method as well, and the work that you've put into that. And so, turning to that framework, and how we can think about applying it to the Giving Circle experience. Maybe we can start with the first pillar, the gather pillar,
Yeah.
and in many ways, you're turning the traditional idea of networking on its head, it seems, by saying that we should strive to create a constellation of relationships. And so I'm curious if you could just share, what does that look like? And how does this differ from the traditional ideas of networking that people might have in their minds when they hear that term, networking? Because I think sometimes that has a little bit of a,
Yeah.
exactly.
Oh yeah,
Little
look up.
edge.
If any of you happen to have a Merriam-Webster dictionary next to you, which of course so many of us still hold on to, joke. If you look up the definition of networking, it is kind of icky. You kind of want to take a shower. And if you notice, my book is called The Lost Art of Connecting. It's not called The Lost Art of Networking. But networking is important. I run a company. I have had to network my entire life, and I will have to network the next how many years I'm around. Connecting, what I believe, is much more reciprocal, much more long-term, much less transactional. And the underlying thesis of my book was this notion that we flip networking on its head. And instead of walking into rooms thinking, what can people give me? What can people do for me? How can these people help me? Is instead thinking about your superpowers and walking into rooms, virtual rooms, or, dinner room, wherever, regular rooms, whatever we call them now. And think about how we can be helpful. How can we be supportive? How can we make introductions? So it's flipping what we had traditionally been taught. And the gather phase is really thinking about that self-audit. What are your goals over the next 1 year, 3 year, 5 years? And what are your superpowers? And believe me, no matter what point of your life you are, whether you just graduated college, whether you're mid-career, whether you're approaching retirement, you have superpowers. You have secret sauces. And my suggestion to everyone in this room is don't overthink it, right? It could be that you speak multiple languages. It could mean that you make amazing tomato sauce. It could mean that, you know your way around Chinatown and you can recommend the best dumplings. Okay. So the point is think of all the ways you can be helpful to others. Also in the gather phase, you think about how you're going to do everything you can to break that hermetically sealed bubble that so many of us live in, myself included, where we tend to attract and connect with people who look like us, sound like us, the same race, age, and color as us. And the connection there to, I think, what you have built also is when you come together in terms of philanthropy and giving, you come from all walks of life. Right? That is not a monolith, right? So to me, the gather phase is that kind of like self-audit to find out who you are, how you best can be moving through rooms and your world, leading with how you can be helpful. That's the gather phase.
I love that. Please go ahead.
No, and the notion about the constellations is that came from, if you look back at antiquity, when people would look up at the stars to make sense out of what they were seeing, they assigned the constellations. So essentially, they were stories that they created. And all those constellations, even though you see the Big Dipper here and Capricorn here, they actually overlap. So this notion is when we introduce people, when we help people make connections, we're creating tapestries, we're creating stories, we're creating impact. Impact we won't even know because it could happen 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road. So that is the kind of imagery of constellations.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, like you and I, we had no idea that we both knew Heather Myers.
Right.
this is somebody that they went to graduate school together.
Yeah.
And who knows what's going to come from that. Anyway,
Right.
I digress.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing. It's a great visualization too, thinking about it, the constellation. And this whole idea of entering a room and thinking about what you can help, how you can help, what you can give, as the first thought that comes to mind is so great, because we often talk about this give first mentality and how just being in a giving circle, you're already joining a community with this idea of giving, right? And so we're already in that mindset. And I think it really bodes well for people entering this community with that in mind, and really opening them up to these kind of meaningful connections. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your second pillar, the ask pillar, and how this kind of flows from that.
Sure. So you're in the gather phase, and ask phase is learning to ask the meaningful questions of others so that you can get a sense, better understand what their hopes and dreams and desires are, because now you understand ways you can be helpful, right? This also level sets when you walk into a room. If you ask people meaningful questions, for those of you who may be shy or introverted, guess what? Then you get to sit back and listen, and you don't have to talk. But the challenge, of course, in the ask phase is attuning and to listening, which can be really, really hard, especially because of all the distractions that we now have. And again, when I say room, it can be a virtual or in real life room. But one of the people I interviewed for the book was a gentleman named Dr. Julian Treasure. He's done 6 or 7 TED Talks on how to be a better listener. And one of the things I felt really described me was something called anticipatory listening. In my desire to be helpful, I'm always like already on to the next thing. And he saw it right away. And he's like, Susan, you have to slow down. But also one of the things I also learned about being a better listener is it's okay to let somebody know if you zoned off. In other words, I think for many, many years when we're coming of age professionally, we would never want to admit while someone was talking that we actually were dreaming about the Thai food we wanted to order that night for dinner. But actually, vulnerability is part of all of this, right? Like being your true self. So now if I am in conversation and I zone off or I miss something, I will tell the person. And in some ways, I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that that's a gift, letting somebody know that what they were saying was important enough that you wanted them to repeat it. Okay. So the ask phase, again, is really learning to ask the meaningful questions of others and then doing the best you can to listening for the cues, because the next phase, the third phase, is do. So you take what you hear, what you listen to, what you learn, what you're able to galvanize from that person, and then you go to town, meaning, you don't have to write them a $10,000 check. You don't have to,
although if you want to, I'm sure that's appreciated.
Right. But I think sometimes when people hear that, they may be immediately thinking, wait, I don't have time to help people. I'm so busy. I'm this and that. But again, this is over like the long term. And it may be something you can do tomorrow. It may be something you can do next year.
It strikes me, Susan, it's almost like just asking those meaningful connections and really trying to listen in a way is a form of giving too. It's a way of being helpful and I don't know, a present. Having someone be very present with you is also a gift in a way.
Well, one of the workshops or a couple of workshops I've done, what we do is when you meet people, you learn enough about them so that when you introduce them to somebody else, that other person really gets a sense of who they are, right? As opposed to, hi, this is Emily. Emily lives in New York City. She runs this really innovative organization that's helping galvanize people giving, right? Instead, it would be, Emily happened to just be in Turkey last week, and she's now giving tours starting next year. I'm being silly. Like, I don't know where.
Like, ooh, that's a different reality I could explore.
It was a week ago, so I thought of Turkey. But, and I termed it giving someone's Oscar speech, because when you think about the Oscars or the Emmys or the Tonys, when somebody wins, they don't just like name off the films or the plays the person starred in. They give you little tidbits about the person's life. So I think the reason I'm sharing this is you made the comment of when we show people we're listening to them, when we remind them of what we heard, that's a gift. And we shouldn't like diminish the importance of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it's also a gift to ourselves in a way, right? You're calming everything else down. You're staying present. You're really making the most of this moment and this conversation, whatever it might be. And so, Susan, as we think about this, the do phase, I'm thinking, what does that look like? Are there some more practical tips around what that looks like as far as follow-ups, conversations? I feel like your book has so many great ideas around this and just being a practical guide. Is there anything else you want to share?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the thing is first of all, a lot of people like just think connections are just whatever, right? But I often will ask groups, when you think of all the good things that have ever happened in your life, guess what? I bet a connection had something to do with it, right? So let's not lose sight of how important they are. But in terms of the do phase, I think this is where sometimes people get tripped up because they think, I don't have time, but this is very much about taking the oxygen mask first. I am certainly not suggesting we put ourselves like second, because to be effective, we have to continue our livelihoods, whatever jobs we have. But I think, oftentimes people will assume, somebody will say to them, would you introduce me to somebody? Emily, you could come to me and say, I want to meet the CEO of Nike. Let's just say Nike's a client. And I always ask first, but I always do ask. In other words, I would never say, no, you're not worthy of meeting him, or no, my contact is too busy, because to me, we're giving people a tremendous opportunity when we go to them and say, may I introduce you to? Do you follow me? Because it's like, again, we don't know what we don't know. And if we put blinders on and not want to make introductions or ask for introductions, we're missing so many tremendous opportunities. I mean, I have always lived life that you don't know what you don't know. So I'm the person who will open the door, even though I'm terrified, but I'll open that door, because how dull is if we just never did. So if I can help inspire people, because again, on the other end of that spectrum, you don't know. And the other thing I learned from my parents, which also is woven through the book, is this notion of getting rid of our preconceived notions. And this, given that you help facilitate these, giving circles, I think it's really important that we don't make assumptions based on, somebody's job or where somebody came from, or, how we met them, because again, sometimes we may be really, really surprised. I'll tell you a short story having to do with several nonprofits, so it's relevant to this community. Back in 2017, it was the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. I think some of you may recall. And it was 2:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and I got an email from a friend who said, Susan, can you help my friend Brant, a filmmaker, get in a refugee camp tomorrow in Greece? Wow. And okay, to level set, I for 6 years served on the board of, as you said, the UN Refugee Committee, UNHCR. So it wasn't so far out of left field, but immediately several things went through my mind. One, I was busy. Two, it's really hard to get someone in a refugee camp in Greece the next day. And three, the last thing the world needed was another documentary film about refugees that no one's going to see. So I made an assumption that he was a documentary filmmaker. And I also made an assumption that I wasn't going to be able to make it happen. But I had 20 minutes. I decided, you know what, make some calls. And I did. And I got this fella Brant into the camp the next morning in Lesbos. And it turned out I was mistaken. He was a big budget Hollywood producer and director who had done a number of Tom Cruise films. Because of his journey, he became much more enamored and passionate about the cause of displaced people and refugees. And a month later, a friend of mine who was a consultant for the NGO CARE reached out, and she said, Susan, do you happen to know any filmmakers who could go spend 2 weeks at a refugee camp on the Syrian border in Jordan to train Syrian youth on how to use film to tell their stories. So guess
Wow.
what? I knew who to call. I called Grant. He didn't even hesitate. And not only that, he brought 7 Hollywood producers and directors with him. They
Wow.
spent 2 weeks. They trained these kids. The films came out beautifully. And because of that, Epic Foundation, a major global foundation, created a film institute at this refugee camp that still exists today to help people really articulate their stories. But there's more. He went on to create a narrative short called, at the time, Refugee, that Angelina Jolie happened to see. And for the next few years, took it on the world stage in her role as an ambassador to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And now in 2024, either at Sundance or a film festival later, the further version of this film is going to be released. So you're all going to be able to see it.
Wow.
And it's not a documentary, it's a narrative with actors.
Amazing.
The name of the Netflix series, the French, he's this beautiful Black African actor, French Black actor. Oh my gosh, it's going to make you. I know many of you know the show. It's an amazing.
Yeah, anyone, if anything comes to mind, drop it in the chat for us.
But he stars in it. So
Okay.
the long and short of it, and sorry, that was a band camp story. Lupin, yes, the fellow who stars in Lupin. It stars
There you
in this.
go.
Yes, so there you go. Thank you, Tanea. But I certainly don't want to take credit for all of that happening, but I like to think that I played a small little role in that circle of impact. And the reason I raise this here is that notion of we don't know what we don't know and get rid of our preconceived notions. And I think especially when we are joining groups to contribute, to fund, we do need to open up those blinders and realize that it's a wonderful way to maybe meet people who are different from us, but may have similar values, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
There you go.
I love that. That's such a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing. I'm excited to get to see it.
His name's Brant Anderson, and one of the
Okay.
kindest men I've ever met.
Wonderful. We'll have to look out for that. We'll be sure to share that out with the community.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes. You'll be hearing lots of it, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, and it's so nice to think about this idea of the preconceived notions and kind of checking those, because we do often see giving circles are location based, and we see people coming together across different perspectives and who have different ideas of what's important in the community. And when people come into these communities open-minded, ready to share, but also ready to learn and to be open and have dialogue with others around what's important. Like really wonderful things happen, not only in terms of the money that gets moved to important work happening in the community, but also in terms of the conversations that happen within the community, between Giving Circle members. So really nice to keep that in mind here as well. And I'd love to continue along this theme a little bit more, Susan, like bringing more focus on the Giving Circle experience specifically. Giving circles, they do come in many different shapes and sizes, right? I just mentioned many groups are location specific. And for those groups, many people, they meet in person, but many others are national, and therefore, they're not meeting in person. Maybe they'll have small in-person meetings in some locations, but they might be meeting more often virtually. Some are focused on making impact, in a particular area or around a particular cause or community. And so given this broad diversity of how people are gathering, I'm just wondering if you can share a little bit more around how people can effectively foster connection and engage members virtually. So if they are in that virtual room and not the in-person room, doesn't that change anything? Or do you feel all the same rules apply? Any particular tips you have?
No, I mean, look, being virtual, I mean, nothing replaces being in person, okay? But there are some advantages, right? I mean, like you all think right now, I'm 6 feet tall. When I am in a room, guess what? Most of you probably wouldn't even notice me because I'm so tiny, okay? And I joke, I laugh at that, but it's true. I walk into a room and people don't see me. My license says I'm 5 foot, but we'll just leave it at that, okay? So if I'm in a room full of, 6 foot, 5'11", add heels to that, I'm just this, people see right over me. So 1, it levels the playing field. 2, there's something we can do virtually, and I've been seeing a lot. We can have virtual chats with people, okay? That's really hard to do if you're in a room and somebody's across on the other side of the room. Okay. And, I remember during the pandemic, everybody's like, we're losing those water cooler moments. I'm like, I get it, but you now have other moments, right? Where you can reach out to people. If we were in a conference room and you were sitting around having a meeting, if you started talking to the person next to you in the middle of the meeting, you'd get in trouble, right? And I was always that person getting in trouble. I got a D in conduct in 5th grade. So you could only imagine, in my 20s and 30s in office meetings, it was like, Susan, be respectful.
No passing notes.
Right. I'm channeling my 5th grade teacher, but so I think it's a different dynamic. I don't know if it's worse or better, right? Mm-hmm. I do think for having difficult, meaningful conversations, being in person, of course, is always better. But for meetings, it can be just as effective. I think, what you have to do, though, is, it's very easy for people who are shy or introverted to just kind of revert back. So for whoever the host is, I do think you have to go the extra mile to pull them in. And I think if there's ways to let people know who's going to be in the room before, so people can do a little research on who else is going to be there, I think that can be helpful. So, whatever you can do to lead up to that meeting to make it more dynamic. And icebreakers can be really, really important. I always like to quote, Brene Brown, when she says, instead of asking somebody how they are, because guess what? They're going to say, meh, okay. Fine. Say in, 3 to 5 words, tell me how you're feeling today. Mm. It's a little harder for you to respond with that and say, meh. Right?
You have to be intentional, coming back to your first word.
Yes. Yeah. But I do think starting every meeting, stay away from the weather, right? Mm-hmm. How many of you, can I see a show of hands, when you're waiting for the host to join the Zoom call or the conference call, you talk about the weather?
Oh, right? Yeah, we did it earlier.
But there's absolutely, you gain nothing. When I hear about the weather in Cleveland, I don't learn anything about the person other than whether it's raining or snowing in Cleveland. Look, I don't mean to pick on Cleveland. It's a great place, great sports town, great beer, but come on. So stay away from the weather. I lived in Denmark when I was in college in 1985. And I'll never forget my Danish mom saying to me, you Americans, all you do is talk about the weather just to keep the conversation going. And you know what? That was in 1985. And now 30 some odd years later, 40, how many? I can't add. Me too. So my entire team, when we have our Monday meetings, that is not part of the conversation.
I love that.
Yeah, the intentional icebreakers. So
yes. Yeah, that's great. And it's one thing that we do see with a lot of Giving Circle leaders, like this idea of enabling the community to connect through gatherings is always important. But we're seeing more and more people now going from letting that just be more casual and however it happens to really having specific icebreakers and really trying to encourage that connection more. So it's great to hear that's also something you advocate. As I look through some of the other questions, we've had a lot of great questions submitted from people in the community for you, Susan. So I'm going to ask a few more that have come in from the community. And this one is, it starts with, the impact a Giving Circle has on a nonprofit becomes exponential as it grows, which I love that. That's so true, right? Your community gets bigger and the dollars you're moving and the impact you're having gets bigger and bigger. And so this particular community member is interested then in growing their Giving Circle. And so the questions are twofold. One, how can people use your methodology to help grow their Giving Circle? And then the second one is, for someone saying that the majority of their group's members come from similar socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds, how do you suggest Giving Circle's approach diversifying their membership base? So not just growing it, but also diversifying it. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
Well, let me start with the second one, and then you might need to remind me what the first one is. Okay. One of the things I did several years ago was intentionally ask my friends of color that I wanted to meet more people of color. There was, in the beginning, I felt really awkward asking that question, but the problem is my circles were so white, and by just going through the motion of asking is actually a lovely thing to do. Obviously you want to be, you want to be kind when you say it. It's not like a numbers game, but it's I wanted to meet people who had different upbringings, different backgrounds, and it can be, people of different religions. It can be people from different geographic locations. It can be people who have completely different professional worlds as you, but start with the people that you know and ask them. Okay.
Mhm.
And family members too. You have members in your community. You can ask them to make asks. The other
Mhm.
thing is many of them probably are involved in some civic organizations, maybe faith-based organizations. They can put out the ask there in communities where they feel comfortable making the ask.
Mhm.
Okay, every time I moved around, geographically, and every time I would move to a new city, I would join either like a democratic or a civic organization. I would end up volunteering, and inevitably, because of that, I would meet people different from me. And so it's back to that intentionality. So that would be my first and foremost recommendation. And I think it's okay to say we need people who are different from us, and you put that on your socials, on LinkedIn, wherever you communicate. All right.
That's great.
First
Yeah.
question. Remind me the first question again.
Yeah. Well, and that was the harder one. And I'll just add to that too. When we talk to Giving Circle leaders about this as well, and it's come up, is not only ask, and kind of that's always the first thing, but another thing is just being really thoughtful about the why. Why are you trying? And kind of like what you were saying before, it's not a numbers game, but what is, the more the authentic reason why you're trying to expand this community, because we need more diverse perspectives to help inform this community and where these funds are going, and making sure we're being impactful, and whatever that core why is. I think that can help guide people and also help them feel more confident breaking through whatever
Yeah.
hesitation they might have with those kinds of conversations.
I think people sometimes are just afraid to ask that question because it may sound, the art of gathering, Priya Parker, of course, but it's okay to admit, like, my bubble has been, we need to break out of those bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely.
There's an amazing organization called Starts With Us that was founded by the founder of Kind Bar, Daniel Lubetsky, and it's all about how do you have conversations with people who differ from you, very different from what I was just describing to you all, because I'm not suggesting we have by meeting people who are different means they have different opinions, but that's also a possibility. And what this organization really does is it gives you the tips and tools for how do you have difficult conversations with people who may differ from you. So that could be another kind of tip for people who are putting these communities together.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I think the first question, Susan, was just how can your methodology be used for people to help grow their groups?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, when you meet people in these groups, you don't know what's going to happen, right? These people could be, their next love interest. These people could be, their next employers. These people could be their next clients. These people could be their children's, school teacher. Like, the thing is to me, it's that whimsical business of people coming together, not knowing, but also coming together around a theme that people care about. So I do think it's part of that, like the just the unknown, which is magical, as opposed to when we typically think of the unknown as scary. I see all the questions coming through, so I have to not read them and continue on my.
We're going to turn to the questions in the chat here in a moment.
Yeah.
We're almost there.
But so much of the book is like being open to people who you typically wouldn't meet in your day-to-day life. So to me, your giving circles are a fabulous way to encourage people to put safety aside. Not that it's unsafe, but come with new ideas, but also know you are coming together to make an impact.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, one other thought that comes to my mind is thinking about the invitation. Inviting someone else into your giving circle is also an offering, an opportunity that you're providing someone, right? So if you're in another room, maybe you're in the local Rotary Club or a women's group or at an event, wherever it might be, thinking of this same method being applied in those spaces, and your giving circle being an opportunity that you can share with people as you're learning more about them and whether or not they might be interested.
in the book, I talk about FOMO versus JOMO. And, we all know what FOMO is, right? Like when you look on Instagram and you see all your friends at a party that you didn't get invited to. But JOMO, people assume it's the joy of missing out. And I instead say JOMO is the joy of meeting others. And my suggestion to people is by being the convener, you get to help make the let's just call them the rules, but you don't have to be the only convener. In other words, you're hosting the giving circle, but you have the power of all these other people bringing. So what starts as maybe 4 or 5 people, if each person brings 1 or 2 people, the multiplier effect takes hold, and therefore JOMO takes precedent over FOMO. And I've often found if I'm going to find myself left out, I'm going to host. That way nobody could leave me out. Right?
I love that. JOMO over FOMO. That's a good one. Good takeaway. Fantastic. And also a good tip for anyone who's maybe interested in being a giving circle leader. I know Gabby's always looking for more members to step up and be one of the co-leaders of groups. So there you go.
I love
There's
that.
a good prompt. Well, one other question, Susan, from me, and then I'd love to turn to the audience and get some more in here. But one thing that we often talk about in the giving circle space is how funding is obviously important, but how giving circles and what they bring, the kind of impact they can have goes beyond that. So there's this concept of the 5 T's, treasure is one, but time, talent, testimony, there are more T's and ways that you can support. And so with the giving circle, one of the things that often comes up is around volunteering. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how that increases our time affluence, I believe is a term that you use, and how it can boost one's contributions to the community, but also maybe the benefits that someone receives, and kind of boost to their own confidence and self-esteem.
Years ago, Adam Grant wrote Give or Take. And one of the things he stated in the book, which rang very true to my life, was the more meetings you take, the more efficient you are. Okay. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody accept every meeting when somebody comes to you and says, can I pick your brain? Which, by the way, is not the best terminology. Instead, they should write you and think of a way they can be helpful and then ask for your time. But I did end up interviewing Adam for the book, and we talked a bit about that. And I do fervently believe that. So if you structure your time where you're volunteering, you actually become more efficient, because the remaining free time you have, you are much more judicious with. Okay. So I see it as a way to become more, like, have the ability to do more. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Okay.
I feel that way too. I mean, there's a certain limit of how many meetings you can cram in, but they go from an hour to 45 to 30 to 20 minutes, and you're still getting the meat of it in.
But also, it doesn't always have to be a meeting. It can be a text, it can be an email, it can be a phone call. I think sometimes we end up putting more anxiety into the actual formation of it than just doing it and seeing the good that comes out of it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I apologize, folks. It's getting darker here, so my lighting is getting kind of squirrely. So
we can see you just fine.
Oh.
Okay, so wonderful. Thank you, Susan, for answering all my questions. And I do have more, because we have more that were submitted in advance of this session as well. But I do want to take a moment to open it up to those who are here. And I see some questions have come in, as Susan pointed out. So I wonder, Gabby, if you're there and if you've been keeping an eye on the chat, and anything you want to surface for us to focus on first.
Yeah, one thing I'll just surface is we've had a couple of people mention in the chat that they're having trouble with engagement in their group. There may be 20 people in their group, but only a couple people are coming to events. Do you have any initial thoughts on that, Susan? How people can re-engage people, or just engage
food
in general?
Give them food. Or booze or pizza. That's a tough one, right? I mean, if people are not engaged, are you saying they're not showing up, or they're coming and they're being kind of just like not participating?
Sounds like not showing up at all, but Brett and Terry, feel free to jump in.
Brett,
I think just not coming, attending. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you may need new members of your group. I mean, I don't want to, it's hard, right? If people, especially for something like this, where you need participants and you need people who are passionate. I mean, I think you can reach out to them and ask them why, and find out what would make it, again, I hate to be, I'm sounding like a broken record, but intentionally, like, ask them, what would it take for you to come? What are we not doing? But I think that the only thing you can do is you can do your best. And if they don't come, you find new members. And I hope that doesn't sound trite.
Yeah, that's a great
No, I
answer.
think that's great. Oh, sorry, Gabby, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that intentionality, just asking it.
Right. And one other thing I will note is that I think sometimes with giving circles, it's important for us to keep in mind too, that people are engaging in different ways. So that if they're in your giving circle and they're donating, they might be really busy right now and not able to attend, but they're still donating. And that way they are participating in the most important way possible.
Such a good point. Yeah. And, when I've been involved in nonprofits, which of course is separate from giving circles, people ebb and flow. There's times in their lives where they may have, an ill parent or sick children or job issues. So, they may come and go, and maybe give people that freedom. But I do think it's worth having a conversation and letting them know that they're missed. And giving them the grace that if there are things going on, that you're still going to hold a seat for them.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Like letting people know that they're missed.
Yeah.
At the end of it, right? That makes
we're
you
all
feel
human. I mean,
yeah.
The same way we get FOMO, we like to know we're being missed.
Absolutely.
There's also one here from Tania. I just want to call out. I think it's such a great question. And I think we saw this come through actually from someone else as well. But if you're an introvert, how do you do these things you're talking about if you're shy or, an introvert?
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. One, if you remember, the ask phase is asking other people questions, and then guess what? You can sit back and say nothing, right? So there is something about that I know from people I know who are introverts and shy, that rings true. As you can probably tell, I'm not an introvert. I plan on being in my next life, so I can write a book on, but there is a chapter in here, in the book, all about connecting for introverts. But more pragmatically, oftentimes we can find out who's in the room before we go to an event. And certainly you can do that before your giving circle gatherings. And it is helpful if you look up the various people and make determinations ahead of time who it is that perhaps makes sense for you to have a deeper conversation with. And I always say, give the scaffolding of 3. Go with the intention of meeting 3 people, sharing 3 things, and learning 3 things. And then you can go hide in the bathroom or go back to your, home and order, delivery or whatever you do. In New York, you order delivery. But the point is, and it could be 2, it could be 4, whatever kind of your comfort level is. And I say share 3 things, because as hard as that may be for all of us, because vulnerability can be scary, we can't expect others to open up if we don't. So I would say that can be a way to feel okay. And then you can just, I'm done. I did my 3. I can walk away.
Yeah. It's so nice to have a goal like that for the evening as well, right? Because it can often feel when you go to an event, like you don't know, I don't know if you're walking away from something, if that was successful for you, right? Or if that was worth the time you spent away from work. So I think for some people, it can be helpful to have some very particular goals of what to do in an event, and walk away feeling like, okay, they checked those boxes. Wonderful. Okay, Gabby, anything else in the chat that you want to surface, or?
I don't think, no questions here, just some great feedback that people are sharing about how they run their groups and different ways.
I love that.
Yeah, which is really awesome.
I'll add another icebreaker. And it's very apropos, but if you could go anywhere, if there was one problem in the world you could solve in the next week and finances weren't an issue, what would it be? Which I think gets people really thinking about what is possible, and what of course may not be possible, but your hopes and dreams.
Right. Yeah. What they care most about. That's a great one. Yeah, and so I do have a few other questions here, but oh, Andrea, I'm sorry, I see your hand went up. Do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, I just wonder, Susan, this is so juicy and yummy, and I love it. Thank you. And your
Oh,
enthusiasm for this comes across very clearly. I just wanted to ask you, as a you seem like a person who has an intense interest in people. I share that with you. And sometimes when I walk into places where I don't know people, I want to go bottom deep into the ocean. Let's go. Let's just get in there. And I feel like it's too much for people. And so then I'm not really sure, how do I get into the space that's a little more interesting without being like invasive or too much?
well, first of all, I have a feeling that is your own perception of yourself. And I think most people wouldn't think that. And they would probably be relieved if you walked up, because then they wouldn't be standing by themselves or having a very dull conversation with somebody who's probably talking about the weather. So I think the most important thing is be yourself, right? And if you can, find out who's in the room beforehand, and maybe, make a plan that those are the people you're going to seek out. Okay. You can ask the host maybe where they are. And if it's a virtual room, you can take a photo of everybody and then go look them up. I'm not suggesting you stalk them, but look them up on LinkedIn or any social platform, and then follow up with them afterwards. I think that sometimes we assume we have to get it all done in that moment, right? But it could be, how nice is it if you get an email from somebody and it's like, I met you briefly at the event last night. I'd love to get to know you better and learn more about your blah, 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 blah. And maybe there's ways I can be helpful to you. Like, the few times in my life those have come to me, it's wonderful, right? And I should have asked, because I always ask this in groups and it never fails to ring the way I think it's going to. And that is, how often have you received a connection request on LinkedIn? You say maybe yes or no, and then you say yes. And then within an hour, they're trying to sell you something. And instead, what if they maybe researched a little bit about you and offered a way to be helpful and then sold something to you, right? People have to do their jobs. I get it. But it's just going that extra mile. So I think with you, first of all, get rid of that fear of people thinking that about you, because that is completely your perception. And I'm not a psychologist, but I just get a sense, and people have told that to me too. Generally, people want to meet people, and if they don't, they wouldn't be at the event.
That's great.
You're lovely. Thank you.
And I love that you touched on LinkedIn too, Susan, because we had some questions about that, about connecting on LinkedIn. So I think you just answered those very nicely.
In my first professional job, I was a researcher at USA Today. And before I had to interview people, this was in the 80s, the tools I had to research them were the Yellow Pages and the Encyclopedia Britannica. You don't get a lot of information in the Yellow Pages, for any of you who even remember what the Yellow Pages were. Now you have all the resources you possibly could to find out about folks. Yes, there may be one or two people out there that are stealth, but for the most part, you can find out their professional trajectory. You can find out what they're upset about on Twitter. You can find out if they have grandchildren on Instagram. You can find out what causes they support. So there's ways to find out.
Absolutely. And I'll just quickly add to that too, that for giving circles, and for any giving circle actually on Grapevine, we really try and make this easy for you, because we want to help you connect meaningfully with each other and do your best work together through your giving circle and beyond, right? So when you join a giving circle, you'll be able to see events, who's RSVP'd. I just was at a Reno Women for Good event last month, and I was able to see all the people who are going, and it was great. I did my research before, and it meant that when people walked in, I knew who they were. I knew how I could connect with them, had really meaningful conversations and many follow-ups from there. So there's a lot of resources that we're also trying to provide you through the platform so that you can see people's links to their socials and all of these other resources, but also some of those unique things around being in a giving circle that they want to share with you, like the causes they care about, the nonprofits that they've bookmarked that they care about. Those things can be really meaningful conversation starters, much better than the weather anyway. Well, thank you everyone so much for your questions and for everything. I want to wrap us up here in just a couple of minutes. We do have some more questions we could get into, but Susan, I wonder if you have any last thoughts, anything else that you feel like we missed, we should have asked you, anything else to leave this community with?
I mean, I think it's just important to remind people that connecting is like as healthy as running every day and eating kale every day, right? I mean, and I think when we put blockers on, we're harming our health. I mean, I know that sounds like a big gargantuan statement, but all the studies show. So I think, be as open as you can to it. But also know there's going to be times when you just want to be by yourself, and that's okay too.
Yeah. That's great. Giving yourself that grace, like you talked about earlier.
I was supposed to go to an event last night and I went to the gym instead. Don't tell.
Well, that was a very productive and healthy alternative.
Yes, except then I came and had a glass and a half of wine. So there you go.
There you go. Being connected to yourself first, and then all of this can flow from that. Well, thank you so much again, Susan, for joining us today. Really so nice to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. And wonderful meeting all of you. And thank you for the good work you do every day. I mean, you're all making such a difference.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an incredible community, and we're continuing to grow, and with, tips and tricks on all sorts of things like how to connect with more people and how to continue to grow our groups. We'll keep growing this movement. So a lot more to come from all of us. Thank you so much. And I do just want to do a quick, shout out that The Lost Art of Connecting, Susan's book, is available still. So if anyone wants to dive deeper, you can find her book on her website. And I think Gabby's going to put that link in the chat.
Any place, Barnes and Noble, any place books are sold. So
Perfect.
And there's an audio book too, if you can stomach listening to me more.
Oh, did you have to audition to be your own reader?
No, I didn't audition. Okay. But I often say I would do 3 colonoscopies before I would take the book again. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. 3 days straight, 8 hours a day in a teeny little closet, reading out loud with inflection.
Wow.
10 till 5 o'clock. Imagine that. I was like,
it's like the perfect preparation for a book tour, Yes. You're ready for anything after that.
Oh my God. Anyhow, sorry.
So funny.
So if you do it, know that it was such a Herculean effort.
Well, people will now appreciate it more if they get the audiobook, knowing how much went into it. Well, thank you, all of you also for joining us. And we hope you got a lot out of today's session and look forward to seeing you at another event soon. We do have a few upcoming options to connect and engage. And so Gabby, I think you're going to drop a couple in the chat, but anything you want to highlight quickly before we wrap up?
Just that we have our next member mixer on December 8th. It's a great opportunity to network and meet people and put these skills into action that we've heard from Susan. So hope to see some of you there.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Susan.
Happy holidays and stay safe, everyone.
Yes. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy holidays all. Bye.